The first ripple didn't sound like rebellion. It sounded like common sense. When Carlos Alcaraz said the calendar felt too tight and something needs to change, he voiced what many players murmur behind closed doors. Elite tennis has become an almost non-stop marathon that stretches bodies, minds, and careers to their limits. Fresh off one of the most demanding campaigns of his young life, Grand Slams, mandatory Masters 1000s, 500-level obligations, cross-continent flights, constant media, Alcaraz put a spotlight on a system that prizes continuity of content over continuity of health. The reaction was instant and polarizing, revealing just how fragile the balance is between competition, commerce, and player welfare. Support arrived first from those who see the tour's relentless pace up close. Coaches, physios, sports scientists, and players whose seasons have devolved into triage. But skepticism hit just as fast. Critics argued that stars who benefit most from the sport's enormous visibility shouldn't complain about the machinery that made them global figures. The conversation hardened when the topic turned to exhibitions. How can players decry an overcrowded schedule while also appearing at lucrative off-season events? What counts as too much tennis in a sport that sells itself on constant visibility? And who owns the responsibility to slow things down? The players, the tours, or the entire ecosystem? Strip away the noise and Alcaraz's point is structural, not personal. The modern calendar is a machine built for a different era, steadily accelerated by globalization. Since the early 2000s, the ATP and WTA have expanded into new markets, signed longer broadcast deals, and fed a 24/7 content appetite. What used to be a seasonal sport now runs roughly 11 months, with an off-season barely long enough to heal, let alone rebuild. Injuries, especially soft tissue and overuse, have climbed among athletes in their early 20s. Mentally, the toll of permanent travel, press obligations, and performance pressure is obvious. Keeping focus and freshness from January to November is becoming a competitive skill in itself. Alcaraz's voice cuts through precisely because of who he is. The generational standard-bearer, presented as the bridge from Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic to what comes next. If even he, at peak condition, says the rhythm is unsustainable, the obvious question follows: what about everyone else? Yet some within the sport counter that players can self-manage, skip certain events, prioritize rest. On paper, that's true. In practice, the incentives are stacked against it. Rankings, bonus pools, sponsor clauses, appearance fees, and national federation expectations all push stars back onto planes. Tennis celebrates individuality, but the system quietly enforces conformity. Context matters. Alcaraz's year was exemplary and exhausting. From hard courts to clay to grass, back to hard, across 5 surfaces and multiple continents, he logged 70-plus matches. Each run deepened his ranking footprint and his fatigue. That's the sustainability question he raised. Not less tennis forever, but smarter tennis now. His comments also arrived in a transition moment. With the Big Three era receding, commercial momentum leans heavily on new faces: Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner, Coco Gauff, Iga Swiatek. The more they play, the healthier the business looks. That logic, add markets, add weeks, add windows, filters straight into the schedule. Players become the engine and the product. Their endurance, not just their excellence, props up the model. The backlash then zoomed in on optics. Detractors asked, if the workload is unbearable, why accept exhibitions? The economic reality is messy. Top players aren't just competitors. They're brands with obligations. Exhibitions, while technically optional, often serve as lower-risk, guaranteed compensation appearances that substitute for a longer rest which the calendar doesn't truly permit. They're symptoms of the same machine, not the cause of the illness. Underneath all of it sits a bigger truth. Tennis governance is fragmented. The ATP, WTA, ITF, and the 4 slams each pursue their own priorities. Coordination is hard, incentives diverge, and the path of least resistance is expansion. The result is a calendar that prioritizes quantity over coherence and visibility over recovery. In that world, speaking up can be misread as weakness. Federer and Nadal rarely voiced fatigue. They managed it through selective scheduling that their stature allowed. Alcaraz's generation is different. More open, more transparent, and less willing to treat silence as toughness. That's why his remarks matter. They don't ask tennis to shrink. They ask it to evolve. More isn't always better when marginal gains come at the cost of longevity and quality. The reaction, support from some, sarcasm from others, shows a sport caught between tradition and reform, between business and biology. The question is no longer whether change is needed, but whether the stakeholders with power are willing to trade a little short-term comfort for long-term health of the athletes and the product itself. To understand why the calendar debate turns so heated so quickly, follow the incentives. Modern tennis runs on a rolling 52-week ranking system that both rewards volume and punishes rest. Points don't just accumulate, they expire. If a player reached a semi-final last year and skips the same event this year, those points evaporate on schedule, pulling the ranking down even if form is excellent. The practical effect: athletes feel compelled to defend results across continents, regardless of fatigue, travel whiplash, or minor injuries that would benefit from a week off. Rest becomes a risk. Playing tired becomes the default. Layer on mandatory participation rules for the most valuable tournaments and the trap tightens. Masters 1000's extended to 2-week formats have improved on-site fan experiences and broadcaster windows, but they also add days, with more matches and more load. 4 stars. Skipping can trigger fines, reduced bonuses, and reputational turbulence with stakeholders. 4 mid-rank players fighting to enter main draws. There's another squeeze. The field is deeper than ever, matchups are tougher earlier, and the points are concentrated at events they can't easily reach without significant travel costs. The structure pulls everyone forward at once, but the runway for recovery doesn't stretch with it. Sports science paints the parallel picture. On the physical side, cumulative stress injuries, knees, hips, lower back, shoulders, wrists, trend upward in younger cohorts. It's not just match count, it's match type. Slower courts and heavier balls in many venues reward longer, more physical rallies. Baseline exchanges can run 15 to 25 shots routinely, converting tournaments into rolling endurance tests. Between matches, recovery windows remain what they've always been. Add in red-eye flights, abrupt climate shifts, and the nutrition/sleep compromises of constant travel, and you get performance dips that look like loss of form, but are really physiological debt coming due. The mental load is just as real. Competitive saturation, performing under scrutiny week after week, erodes decision quality in big points, frays patience in long rallies, and blunts tactical creativity. In a sport where one bad 10-minute patch can flip a tournament, those marginal declines are fatal. Psychologists working with elite players talk about attention bandwidth as a finite resource. The calendar today spends that currency faster than it can be replenished. So why not copy what Federer or Nadal did late career? Play less, peak more? Because privilege mattered. They could skip segments and keep sponsors and seating protections. A 22-year-old cannot assume those cushions. Bonuses often key off starts at specific events. Endorsement clauses expect marquee visibility. National federations prefer their stars in home weeks. Even exhibitions, criticized as indulgent, can be a calculated compromise. Controlled formats, guaranteed purse, lower competitive stress, used to satisfy commercial obligations without absorbing the ranking risk of another full-throttle week. If the problem is structural, the solutions must be too. The most discussed reform among coaches and performance directors is smarter regionalization. Instead of long-haul pinball, Europe 1 week, North America the next, Asia 2 weeks later, cluster surfaces and geographies into coherent blocks with mandated buffer days. Clay and grass already lean this way. The hardcourt calendar is where chaos blooms. A remap that reduces time zone swings by 8 to 12 hours between consecutive events would cut jet lag debt dramatically and lower injury flags without removing a single marquee tournament. Second, codify protected recovery windows. Not vague off-season ideals, but enforceable rules. Every athlete gets 2 guaranteed no-sanction rest slots, 7 to 10 days each, inside the season, selected by a fixed deadline, with ranking protections for the previous year's results at those events. Yes, it complicates entry lists. Yes, broadcasters will protest. But it would transform the current rest as punishment calculus into rest as policy. Third, rebalance points distribution to reward peak performance over sheer volume. Today, missing 1 mandatory can crater a ranking more than 3 solid 500-level weeks can repair. Shifting a modest percentage of points from early rounds to later rounds at key events, while offering a small continuity bonus for playing within a regional swing, would encourage players to target health-aligned peaks rather than chase every stamp in the passport. Fourth, standardize ball types and publish court pace targets earlier. Sudden changes in ball weight or felt can spike elbow and shoulder complaints across a swing. Transparency allows teams to pre-adapt training loads. Similarly, publishing CPIs, court pace indices, months ahead mitigates surprise attrition, where a slow surface turns a week into a grind the body didn't budget for. Fifth, real player power. Councils help, but a unified independent association with narrow, concrete bargaining aims, minimum recovery standards, travel buffers, medical baselines, and a say in calendar mapping, would turn press room frustration into negotiable policy. This isn't about shrinking the sport. It's about making the existing product sustainable. There are trade-offs. Fewer back-to-back promotions, tighter broadcast windows, and a learning curve for fans. But the upside is quality. Sharper peaks, healthier stars, fewer mid-match retirements, and careers that last long enough to build rivalries the public can invest in. The alternative is what we're already seeing. More weeks with diminished versions of the best, more late-season attrition, and more seasons decided by who survived, not who excelled. Every reform proposal sounds elegant on paper, until you follow the money. Tennis doesn't run on a single balance sheet. It's a patchwork of empires. The 4 Grand Slams, the ATP, the WTA, the ITF, and dozens of private tournament owners. Each controls its own slice of the calendar, its own sponsorship ecosystem, and its own broadcast deals. Any reduction in weeks or travel means fewer ticket days, fewer ad slots, fewer tourism dollars. That's why every solution crashes into the same wall. No one wants to be the first to sacrifice revenue for rest. At the top of that pyramid sit the slams: Australia, Roland Garros, Wimbledon, and the US Open. They don't count as ATP or WTA events, yet they drive almost 60% of total media visibility and prize money prestige. They occupy fixed dates and locations that cannot move without collapsing tradition. Around them, tournaments jostle for proximity. Every city wants the week before or after a slam to capture that halo. The result? A compressed grid that grows tighter every year. ATP and WTA management publicly acknowledge calendar challenges, but privately, expansion pays too well to stop. New markets, China, the Gulf, South America, offer massive hosting fees. The Masters 1000s, once 9, are pushing toward 12. And for each new site, someone must travel, play, and fill a TV window. The physical toll belongs to the players. The financial benefit doesn't. That disconnect sits at the heart of Carlos Alcaraz's complaint. When he says, something has to change, he's not asking for less tennis. He's asking for a model where the system shares accountability instead of exporting fatigue downward. Sponsors, meanwhile, live off exposure. They buy not tournaments, but faces: Alcaraz, Sinner, Swiatek, Djokovic, Goff. The more these stars appear, the more impressions they generate. A shorter calendar threatens those metrics. Even exhibitions, often used as soft landings for players, serve as global billboards for luxury and tech brands. Cancel them, and the marketing pipeline shrinks. Keep them, and critics cry hypocrisy. Either way, the athlete remains the product. Federations add another layer of pressure. National bodies rely on their stars to appear in home events or team competitions to attract funding. Skip a Davis Cup or Billie Jean King Cup tie and social media erupts in accusations of disloyalty. Yet, those same institutions rarely contribute meaningfully to the player's long-term health management. The contradiction is structural. Tennis celebrates independence, but its economics demand obedience. Then comes the politics of hierarchy. Players outside the top 20 reform through a different lens. For them, a condensed schedule means fewer draws, fewer opportunities, and potentially less prize money. A longer calendar, however punishing, creates more slots to earn. Any attempt to shorten the season risks being painted as elitist, protecting millionaires at the expense of grinders. This divide fractures the player base and weakens collective bargaining. Meanwhile, tournament directors argue that fatigue is part of the job. In private meetings, they reference historical precedent. Rod Laver played year-round exhibitions on multiple continents without modern recovery tools. The romanticism ignores scale. The 2025 Tour hosts roughly 64 ATP and 58 WTA main events, each demanding travel, press duties, and fan engagement. Laver never had to fly Sydney, Dubai, Cincinnati in a month while posting sponsor content mid-flight. Inside the locker room, Opinions split by generation. Veterans nod at Alcaraz's frustration but remember that progress came slowly even for them. Younger players, raised in a 24/7 digital loop, crave transparency and agency. They don't want fewer matches, they want smarter organization and a seat at the table. For them, wellness and brand value are not opposites but allies. A healthy athlete markets better than an exhausted one. Behind closed doors, the ATP Player Advisory Council has floated pilot ideas. Regional clusters, limiting travel to 3 continental zones per quarter. A mandatory rest quotas, 2 per season, enforced by ranking protection. A recovery audits, independent medical panels reviewing workloads. A revised prize distribution, rewarding depth of performance over attendance. None of these require fewer tournaments. They require coordination, a resource tennis famously lacks. To implement even one would need unified scheduling across organizations that barely share data. Still, pressure mounts. Social media amplifies every injury withdrawal. When Alcaraz, Swiatek, or Rune skip events, hashtags trend, pundits debate, and sponsors quietly call for reassurance. Visibility cuts both ways. The same global platform that promotes the sport also exposes its cracks in real time. Tennis now stands at a crossroads between sustainability and spectacle. Does it want a decade of explosive expansion or a century of endurance? Reform means risk. Status quo means attrition. The players' bodies have become the scoreboard. The deeper truth of Carlos Alcaraz's words wasn't rebellion, it was foresight. Because beneath the glow of packed arenas and glittering trophies, professional tennis is quietly flirting with burnout on an institutional scale. Every year, more players are forced to step away not because of lack of talent or motivation, but because the calendar itself has become unsustainable. The warning signs are everywhere. Chronic injuries at younger ages, early retirements, increasing mental health breaks, and a visible decline in energy as seasons drag into November. Alcaraz's statement, simple yet daring, has peeled back a layer of denial the sport can no longer afford. To understand the urgency, look beyond the stars. The middle and lower ranks, the thousands of professionals grinding through Challenger and ITF events, live on the razor's edge. They travel economy, manage their own logistics, and depend on constant play just to break even. For them, rest equals lost income. The same tour that exhausts the elite crushes the rest. Those who can't sustain 40-plus weeks a year simply vanish. Tennis replenishes itself not through reform, but through replacement. New talents rising as old ones burn out. It's efficient, brutal, and quietly unsustainable. Meanwhile, the sport's architecture remains stuck in the past. There's no single governing body capable of rewriting the system. The ATP and WTA compete for sponsorship share, the ITF defends its legacy events, and the slams sit atop their own empires. Coordination collapses under commercial self-interest. Every tournament claims to honor tradition, but tradition has become the shield that blocks evolution. The irony? Tennis, the sport that measures everything in precision and timing, runs on a calendar built without rhythm or restraint. Players like Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner, and Iga Swiatek represent a new kind of leadership, one that values transparency over stoicism. They are no longer afraid to say that fatigue is real, that mental recovery matters as much as physical conditioning. Their openness doesn't make them weak, it makes them modern. This generation grew up watching idols like Federer and Nadal sacrifice their bodies for longevity. Now they want to learn from those lessons rather than repeat them. Even Novak Djokovic, the Iron Man of his era, has started echoing similar concerns. At 38, he knows firsthand the cost of endless seasons. You can't fix the future by pretending the present doesn't hurt, he said recently. A sentence that could easily summarize the state of the sport. Tennis's obsession with permanence has become its own Achilles heel. It refuses to pause, even when everyone agrees it needs to. There are solutions on the table. The idea of a regionalized season, grouping tournaments by continent, could cut travel time and carbon emissions by nearly 40%. A mandatory rest window could be enforced with protected rankings, allowing recovery without penalty. Independent player unions, separate from the ATP and WTA, could negotiate minimum recovery standards and push for transparent scheduling votes. Each reform sounds radical until you realize it's simply logical. Every other global sport, from football to Formula One, operates with defined off-seasons. Tennis alone pretends perpetual motion is progress. The resistance to change remains cultural as much as financial. For decades, silence equaled toughness. Players were expected to endure, not question. But in the social media age, that silence has cracks. Fans now see what happens behind the curtain. The taping, the painkillers, the jet-lagged interviews. Compassion isn't bad for business anymore. It's part of it. The athletes who survive will be the ones who learn to balance exposure with endurance. Carlos Alcaraz's words may not change tennis overnight, but they've started a reckoning. The sport stands at a crossroads where every choice matters. Keep expanding until the system collapses, or evolve before it breaks. The truth is, no athlete, not even Alcaraz, can carry an entire machine forever. The real question isn't whether the calendar will change. It's how much damage must happen before it does. In the end, the solution might begin with something radical in its simplicity. Listening. Listening to players when they say they're tired. Listening to science when it warns about long-term strain. Listening to fans who care more about longevity than quantity. Because protecting tennis's future isn't about fewer matches. It's about more meaning. And that, perhaps, is the message behind Alcaraz's quiet plea. If tennis wants to keep inspiring, it must first learn to breathe. Tennis, if you believe the next generation deserves a smarter, safer future, hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts below. Would you shorten the season? Add rest quotas? Or push for a unified player association? Let's start the debate that could save the sport we love. Speech balloon fire.